623. It is 11 January 2021. And this is not news. This isn't Ford Observer. I'll get to those. But this was good, and I needed to read this and put this out. All of the best men I know, the good men who are good at being men, just want to be left alone. The best men I know believe in individual freedom. They don't want to control other people. The best men in America and throughout the world want to be able to do what they want. And they want other people to do what they want with their own bodies and resources. They don't want to be forced to do or say things they don't think are right. They don't want to force other people to do or say things they don't think are right. These men understand the need for some consensus to maintain law and order and the protection of individual rights and property, but they are fundamentally anti-fascist and anti-totalitarian. For the most part, they want to mind their own business, and they want to limit the power of the state. They want the state to pave the roads, protect property, provide basic services, and then mind its own business and stay out of people's personal and professional lives. Though the name is tainted, these are liberal values. Americans led the way in opposing authoritarian regimes and ruled them from far away. They understood that freedom is not anarchy, but localized self-determination. They believed in the right of small groups to determine for themselves how they want to live. I've always believed that the people of San Francisco or Portland or Seattle have no business telling people in Alabama or even the small towns 100 miles from them what to do or how to live, and vice versa. Frankly, I don't think people in Alabama or small towns across America care how people in San Francisco or Portland and Seattle live. They may mock them, but they are content to let San Franciscans be San Franciscans as long as San Franciscans mind their own business and leave them alone. Unfortunately, in the events of the year 2020, if the events of the year 2020 have or should have taught us anything, it is that this belief will not be reciprocated. Just as the conservatives of old seem to have been kept up at night by the idea that someone somewhere was having some kind of unapproved fun, the progressives in cities seem to be perpetually incensed by the thought that somewhere the people they hate who live in the backward places they never go to are failing to worship and affirm their own sacred cows. These urban quote-unquote progressives want to force people who they don't know or even like to do and say and profess the things that urban progressives believe, whether those country barbarians like it or not. They are tyrants motivated by a culture of resentment against the values held by people who live in the places that in many cases they abandon for big city life. These tyrants believe that they're better educated and qualified to tell everyone else what they should believe and how they should live. They share a constantly evolving utopian vision, and like the communists and fascists of the 20th century, they're not just going to leave you alone. Their feel-good mottos proclaim that no one is free until everyone is free, but what they really mean is they won't stop until everyone agrees with them, submits to their self-proclaimed authority, and acknowledges the expertise of their experts. That you won't be free until you agree. And if you have to agree to be free, then you are never really free at all. So many of the best men I know share a similar fantasy. They want to move to the country or to a little cabin in the middle of nowhere. They want to escape to somewhere where they can be free, where they can be left alone. A lot of people assume that when I wrote Becoming a Barbarian, I was telling them to live off-grid in the wilderness someplace. Many thought I was doing that at Waldgang, even though that was never the case. Actually, in becoming a Barbarian, I wrote, "There are no more new worlds, no readily habitable and fertile uncharted lands to discover. The reach of commercialism and its universalist monoculture is always expanding, even into unstable and untamed zones like Africa or Afghanistan, and most will keep expanding until there is a McDonald's in every mosque and the world's most volatile religion is moderated into another meaningless consumer identity. You could spend all your resources in the best years of your life trying to fuck off to some rugged oasis, only to find a few years later that Global Corp will be bulldozing your Eden to make room for chain stores and condominiums. Last year when the pandemic hit, I thought I'd be safe from the worst restrictions because I lived in a small town in the middle of nowhere. And we were freer there. At times. But not much. The empire of nothing reached out from the cities and imposed its rule in small places too. In towns where the virus never made an impact, small businesses were still forced to close and livelihoods were destroyed. I believe that this was done purposefully and maliciously. These places that resisted were punished with the restrictions that had no relationship to the presence of the virus. And if a rationale for the restrictions was needed, experts were sent out to model a reason why it was far bigger a threat in that area than it ever was. I finally left Oregon and moved to Utah. Many argue that the two major political parties are the same. That may be true among the major players in DC, but it was undeniable that cities in red states were far freer than even tiny towns in blue states. I recently drove through Goldendale, Washington, and watched a father who owned a small restaurant look sadly out the door of his closed restaurant, hoping for a to-go order. His family-operated restaurant used to be packed every Sunday, and it was the best place to eat in town. He'd been making a decent living and living free in a small town in the middle of nowhere, 4 or 5 hours away from Seattle or Olympia. I'm sure he wanted nothing to do with those cities or the people in them. I doubt his business will survive this year. It was sad to see, and a terrible injustice. Goldendale, Washington is full of preppers and farmers and people living off grid. I'm sure some of them are doing fine, but their community is being controlled and their businesses are being destroyed by people hundreds of miles away who don't care if they live or die or are forced into bankruptcy. They might as well be colonies ruled by foreign kings. You can move to a small town in the middle of nowhere and live off grid if you want to, but the empire of nothing has made it clear that they're not going to leave you alone. In the long term, there's nowhere to run. Even now, they're controlling the technology that you use to communicate with each other and the outside world. You can find workarounds, but these workarounds are all temporary fixes. The empire of nothing demands compliance and conformity. As I also wrote in Becoming a Barbarian, the conquering narrative of the empire of nothing is a narrative of total unity. In exchange for accepting the narrative, the empire offers a comforting, multicultural hospice as you pass into the void. I have variously identified as a heathen. I have variously identified as a heathen or a pagan. While these words are associated with belief systems, they were originally used as a pejorative insult for resistant country people who refused to conform to the mainstream belief of previous cosmopolitan empires. The people who attempt to practice the religions of ancient heathens and pagans today are called neo-pagans because their beliefs have been dead for over 1,000 years. The practices of heathens and pagans didn't survive. Do you really want to take a cue from them and become resistant country people? It's not a winning strategy. A lot of the men who want to escape to a cabin in the middle of nowhere realize idealize Thoreau's Walden. While the cabin is out there, far from everything and almost everyone, it represents a passage inward, a quieting of the mind, of the din of other voices. Life in the cabin is meditation. Parts of Walden itself read like a mindfulness meditation script. When Thoreau muses on the songs of the whippoorwills or the sounds of the passing trains, he's slowing down and paying attention. As social animals, we are continually reacting to the words and actions of other men and women, directing our attention outward. By tuning out other people and tuning into the simple sounds and sensations of being creatures who are alive in the world, we naturally turn our attention inward. And the faculties we use to assess others can be employed to analyze and better understand ourselves. This is a worthwhile exercise and worth doing as an exercise, as a retreat, because it It is a retreat not to, but from a man's life. Too often men hide from life by seeking purity in nature, like the saint in Zarathustra who believes that he lives a bear amongst bears, a bird amongst birds. However, the saint is neither a bear nor a bird, he's a man. And to be a man is to be a man among men. And being a man, is being a man any less pure than being a bird or a bear? In a character study, Robert Louis Stevenson roasted Thoreau and called him a skulker who was cruel in the pursuit of goodness and morbid in the pursuit of health. Quote, Thoreau's content and ecstasy in living was, we may say, like a plant that he had watered and tended to womanish solicitude. For there is apt to be something unmanly, something almost dastardly in a life that does not move with dash and freedom, and that fears the bracing contact of the world, end quote. When men talk about retiring to their little cabin in the middle of nowhere, I wonder, what are you going to do there? Are you going there to die? Many forget that Thoreau only stayed in the cabin for a few years. He wrote, I left the woods for as good a reason as I went there. Perhaps it seemed to me that I had several more lives to live and could not spare any more time for that one. By all means, plan a retreat to a little cabin in the middle of nowhere. Some time spent alone chopping wood and listening to the whippoorwills is probably going to be good for the soul. But it's not a long-term strategy. Because as I've said, even there, they're not going to leave you alone. A lot of the best men I know have escaped to the country, or they want to. However, in leaving the cities, we leave the centers of power and finance and culture creation and the media to others. You left the power and the money and the control of culture and the dissemination of the information in the hands of the worst of men and women. What do you think was going to happen? What did you think was going to happen? We've allowed ourselves to be governed by people who hate us and whose values, to the extent that they even have values, are completely incompatible with our own. Over several generations, we've willingly given up the reins of our chariots and abandoned the natural work of men to create order and culture. What did you think was going to happen? Too many of my readers have accepted cyclical models of history that conveniently absolve them of agency. It is much easier to believe that we are in some preordained bad time, some Kali Yuga or dark age. While cultures certainly move through cycles, these models were developed in relatively finite communities. Taking a broader view, we can see that one culture may be going through a golden age while another is experiencing an internal collapse. Things were bad enough 200 years ago that Americans fought a war for independence and self-determination. Were they in the Kali Yuga too? If so, what would you call the last 200 years? Were the men who fought in the wars 200 years prior and the 200 years before that also in a dark age? Men of every age have experienced hardships and disillusion. But it is and has always been the responsibility of men to create order in the midst of chaos. This is our time, and what's happening now is our responsibility. We just can't run away into the country and let the worst men and women run the world for us and expect things to turn out well. And even if we do, they're not going to leave us alone. It's by Jack Donovan. Well done. Well done. All right. 623 out.